That night, Mason Cole did exactly one thing. He towed an abandoned red Ferrari off the shoulder of Interstate 94 and brought it back to the lot. No owner, no note, no explanation, only shattered glass, a deployed airbag, and the smell of cold wind mixing with something expensive he could not name. He had no idea the car belonged to Jazelle Hartwell, the wealthiest woman in the city whose name appeared on every glass tower he had ever driven past without slowing down. And he had absolutely no idea that what he found hidden beneath the rear floor panel would change the course of both their lives. The Ferrari was no accident, and whatever was hidden inside it had been waiting for the right person to find it. It was 2:47 in the morning when Mason Cole turned the wheel of his tow truck onto the southbound stretch of the interstate and let the hum of the engine fill the silence he had grown comfortable with over the past 14 months. The dashboard lights cast a pale glow across his face. A face that had once sat in a climate-controlled office 12 floors above street level, staring at security logs and data architecture diagrams with the quiet confidence of a man who believed his work mattered. That version of Mason Cole felt a very long time ago now. His hands on the wheel were different hands than the ones that had rested on a keyboard. Rougher at the knuckles, slower to curl into fists, carrying the particular kind of calm that comes not from contentment, but from having already absorbed the worst of what a professional life can do to a person before it stops asking permission. The cold outside had been pressing 40 degrees since sundown, and the road between the North Branch Crossing and the city's southern industrial corridor was the kind of road that felt longer than it measured. 4 lanes, low bridges, the occasional overpass lamp throwing orange light across a stretch of pavement where nothing much happened except the movement of cargo from one part of the city to another. Mason preferred the night shifts. Fewer people, fewer explanations. 3 years before that drive, he had been a senior systems security engineer at Hartwell Digital, the technology division of Hartwell Capital, one of the largest privately held investment firms in Chicago. He had spent those 3 years building the kind of infrastructure that most people never thought about, the kind of work that only became visible when it failed. He had been good at it. He had been proud of it. He had believed, with the particular conviction of a person who invests themselves fully in what they do, that the work he was doing was protecting something that mattered. And then one Tuesday morning in early spring, he had walked into the HR director's office at 8:15 and walked out at 8:40 with a cardboard box and a termination letter citing unauthorized data access. No meeting, no investigation, no questions. The industry had a way of passing information quietly, through back channels and informal lists, through the kind of professional conversations that left no paper trail and required no explanation. And within 6 weeks, Mason had been turned down by 9 companies without a single interview. A recruiter he trusted told him, off the record, that his name was circulating in the wrong way. He stopped applying after the 11th rejection and started looking for something that had nothing to do with a keyboard. The towing company paid $15 an hour on night shifts, plus a small percentage on verified mileage. It covered the rent on the 2-bedroom apartment where he and his 8-year-old son Caleb ate breakfast together every morning before school, and that was the number that mattered most when Mason Cole sat down to calculate what his dignity was worth against what his life cost. Logan Pierce, who ran the day shift and had worked alongside Mason for 11 months, had described him once to a coworker with the simple precision of a man who had seen a lot of people break under significantly less pressure. Mason Cole, Logan said, was the only person he had ever met who could be wronged that completely and not become bitter about it. That quality, that stubborn, unglamorous refusal to become the worst version of himself, was about to become the most important thing Mason Cole possessed. The radio dispatcher's voice came through at 2:51. Abandoned vehicle reported at the north shoulder near the North Branch Crossing. No occupants, significant front-end contact. Mason acknowledged the call and drove toward it without any particular sense of urgency. It was, as far as he knew, the same kind of call he answered 4 or 5 times a week. He had no way of knowing it was not. The Ferrari was a Straydale, deep red, the kind of color that looks almost black under certain light, and it sat at a shallow angle against the concrete median divider with the quiet authority of something that had been moving very fast before it stopped very suddenly. Both front airbags had deployed. The windshield had fractured in a spreading pattern that suggested the impact had been more violent than the vehicle's current position implied. The driver's door was closed. The passenger door was open, swung out at a wide angle and left that way, as though the person inside had stepped out quickly and kept walking without looking back. There was no one at the scene, Not the driver, not a bystander, not even the distant suggestion of someone who had recently been there. The only human evidence was a single nude-colored high-heel shoe wedged between the brake pedal and the lower dashboard trim, discovered later, which said a great deal about the speed and the state of mind of the person who had left. Mason pulled his truck to a stop behind the Ferrari, activated his hazard lights, and walked the perimeter of the vehicle before touching it. Noting the angle of impact, the distribution of damage along the front quarter panel, the position of the steering wheel visible through the fractured windshield. He photographed the scene systematically from all angles, called the non-emergency police line to report the find, and was told that a unit would arrive within 40 minutes. He said he would wait. He sat on the running board of his truck with a cup of coffee that had gone cold sometime before he had the chance to drink it, and he listened to the wind crossing the overpass above him and thought nothing in particular, which was something he had become skilled at over the previous 14 months. When he finally climbed into the Ferrari's cabin to prepare the vehicle for towing, checking the gear selector position, confirming the steering lock, inventorying any visible interior damage, the first thing he noticed was the smell, not the sharp chemical residue of the airbag. Not the metallic undertone that new car interiors carry for the first few years. He noticed perfume. Rich and cool, like something that belonged in a room with tall ceilings and very little furniture and lighting that cost more than his truck. It struck him as odd in the way that out-of-place things sometimes do. Not alarming, just wrong enough to register, the way a footstep in an empty house registers before the mind decides whether to be frightened. He completed his cabin checklist, found a shattered iPhone lying face down beneath the passenger seat, and placed it carefully on the dash rather than leaving it on the floor where it might slide during transport. He logged it in his property inventory. Then he moved to the cargo area, as procedure required, to assess and document any contents before the vehicle was placed on the lift. And it was there, under the rear floor lining, that the ordinary nature of the call ended. The lining did not sit flush. It was a small thing, the kind of detail that most people would have noted and dismissed as a manufacturing tolerance issue. But Mason Cole had spent 3 years in an environment where the difference between what a system was supposed to look like and what it actually looked like was routinely the thing that mattered most, and that habit had not left him even after everything else had been stripped away. He lifted the panel. Beneath it, in a space that was not part of any standard Ferrari configuration, someone had created a custom compartment no wider than a shoebox and roughly 4 centimeters deep, smooth-sided, clean, clearly built with intention. Inside it sat a black leather document case, slim and rigid, with a combination lock built into the clasp. Mason looked at it for a long moment. He did not open it. He photographed it in place, photographed the compartment itself from 2 angles, and then lifted the case carefully and placed it in the cab of his truck, logging it on the property manifest under the line designated for personal effects of unverified ownership held pending claimant. It was the correct procedure. The responding officer arrived 43 minutes later, completed the scene report, reviewed Mason's inventory, and authorized the vehicle for transport. At no point did the officer ask about the leather case. At no point did Mason bring it up unsolicited. It was listed plainly on the property sheet, in the section the officer moved through without particular care, and Mason had no reason then to think that would become relevant. He hooked the Ferrari to the truck, drove it south through the dark, and the only sound for the next 20 minutes was the road beneath his tires and the low creak of the cable. He did not know whose car it was. He only knew that whatever was inside that case had been hidden by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and that they had left it in a hurry. 2 miles east of the crash site, Jazelle Hartwell sat in the window of a hotel suite on the 22nd floor and watched the city arrange itself below her in the kind of ordered geometry that looks like control from a sufficient height. She had been sitting there for 40 minutes without removing her coat. The suite had been reserved under a name that did not belong to her, paid for with a card she kept specifically for situations in which she needed to exist outside her own life for a few hours. Those situations had been rare before. Jazelle Hartwell was 29 years old and had been the CEO of Hartwell Capital for 14 months, a fact that financial publications had covered with the particular blend of admiration and condescension that tends to follow women who inherit significant things. Her father, Bernard Hartwell, had died of a cardiac event the previous spring and had left her a company with 214 employees, a portfolio spanning 6 industries, and a chief financial officer named Adrian Voss, who had worked alongside Bernard for 18 years and who had been, by every visible measure, the most trusted person in the building. Jazelle had known Adrian most of her life, at her father's dinner table, at company events, in the hospital during the last weeks of her father's illness. She had trusted him the way you trust furniture that has always been in the same room, not through conscious deliberation, but through long and uneventful familiarity. 6 weeks before that night, Charlotte Reeves had placed a folder on Jazelle's desk without preamble and asked her to look at pages 14 through 22. Charlotte was Hartwell Capital's senior in-house counsel, a methodical woman in her mid-40s who communicated in measured sentences and who had the particular gift of making very alarming information sound like a procedural update. What was on those pages were transaction records, transfers made through a network of subsidiary accounts that led through a sequence of holding structures to an entity called AVX Holdings, registered in the Cayman Islands, with no listed beneficial owner. The amounts were not small. The internal audit log showed that access to these records had been modified on 3 separate occasions by a user credential linked to Adrian Voss's executive account. Jazelle had not gone to the board. She had considered it and rejected it, because Adrian Voss had spent 18 years building relationships with every person in that room, and if she walked in with circumstantial records and no ironclad documentation, the most likely outcome was that the story would be reframed, not as a fraud, but as a grieving daughter overreaching in a period of institutional uncertainty, a narrative that had already been quietly circulating in certain corners of the financial press. What she needed was something that could not be reframed. Charlotte had spent the following 5 weeks building it in silence. On the night the Ferrari ended up against the highway divider, Charlotte had passed Jazelle a slim black leather case containing a USB drive and a physical copy of a contract, a 2021 agreement bearing Adrian Voss's handwritten signature, authorizing the transfer of $47 million to a project that had never existed. It was the linchpin. Without it, everything else was circumstantial. With it, there was no version of events in which Adrian Voss was not facing federal prosecution. Jazelle had been driving herself without a security detail because the fewer people who knew she had that case, the better. When a panel van ran a red light and the car struck the divider, her first conscious thought after the airbag hit had been the case. She had reached for it. It was not on the seat. In the shock and disorientation of realizing she was uninjured, she had gotten out and stood on the shoulder and tried to reconstruct the sequence of events, and then the sound of approaching headlights had reminded her that a red Ferrari was effectively a billboard, and she was among the most photographed women in the state. She had walked away. Now, sitting in the suite in one shoe, she understood with perfect clarity what she had left behind. She reached for her phone and dialed Charlotte. Voicemail. She set the phone on the windowsill, looked at the city, and thought about her father's instruction. Find the next right thing to do, find it, and do only that, and understood that the next right thing was to find the car before someone else did. She found the lot at 8:47 the following morning, arriving in a black Escalade with no visible plates, dressed in a way that made clear she had not slept and had made a considered decision not to disguise that fact. The lot was a working space, cracked asphalt stained with old oil, 3 tow trucks in varying states of maintenance, a prefab office building with a whiteboard visible through the narrow window, a smell of gasoline and hydraulic fluid that had probably been embedded in the concrete since before anyone currently employed there had been born. Logan Pierce was the first to see her step out of the vehicle, and he stood very still for a moment in the manner of a person who has recognized a face from a magazine cover and is making sure he is not wrong. Mason Cole was in the back bay, crouched beside the rear differential of a sedan that needed more work than its value justified, when Logan leaned through the door and told him there was someone asking about the Ferrari. Mason wiped his hands on a shop rag, walked out into the morning light, and stopped at a courteous distance from the woman standing in the middle of his lot in a cashmere coat, looking at the covered Ferrari with the concentrated focus of someone calculating a next move. He waited. She told him who she was. She told him she was there for the car and for everything inside it, and she said it in the tone of someone accustomed to procedural portions of conversations being brief. Mason listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The vehicle is held under police authorization and cannot be released without the registered owner's documentation and a counter-signature on the property manifest." He said it the way he might have said the lot opens at 7, without apology. without the slight yielding quality that Jazelle Hartwell had learned to detect in people who said no to her while simultaneously calculating how much it would cost to change their mind. She asked him if he knew who she was. He said he did. She asked if that changed the procedure. He said it did not. The silence between them had edges. She was not accustomed to refusal that came with no calculation behind it. No positioning, no implicit leverage, no barely visible angle. Mason Cole did not appear to want anything in particular from this conversation. He appeared to be waiting for her to decide whether she wanted to comply with a straightforward administrative process or spend both their mornings making it complicated. Jazelle reached for her vehicle registration and found she did not have it. The Ferrari was registered to a company subsidiary, and the documentation was filed in an office she was not currently standing in. And she had left her wallet and her regular phone in the car when she walked away from it, and she had not had time to retrieve either one. She stopped, Mason noticed. He did not point it out or make it a moment. He moved to the counter inside the office, placed a property claim form on the surface and slid it toward her. A standard sheet with a handwritten note at the top, explaining which fields required supporting documentation. He said she was welcome to return that afternoon with the paperwork, and that the vehicle and all logged contents would be held securely in the meantime. Jazelle looked at the form. Then she looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. With the precise, unhurried attention she gave to anything she could not immediately categorize. And in that moment she registered something that she had not expected. This man had no visible gap between what he was saying and what he wanted. In 14 months of running a company that had been systematically undermined, she had become very skilled at finding that gap. Everyone had one. Everyone concealed something, made small adjustments in real time, calibrated their behavior toward an objective they did not state. Mason Cole appeared to be doing none of those things. He appeared to simply mean what he said. That was in itself the most unusual thing she had encountered in a long time. She was still considering that when her phone rang and Charlotte's voice came through in short, flat sentences, "Adrian knows the car was towed. He knows this lot. He has already made calls." Jazelle walked back to the Escalade without finishing the conversation. She sat in the back seat and looked at the lot and thought about the man inside who had her leather case logged on a property manifest under a line item that no one had read carefully, who had refused her with no apparent motivation beyond the integrity of an administrative procedure, and who had no idea what was about to arrive at his door. She thought about whether to warn him. She thought about whether she could afford to trust him. She thought about the fact that she was currently out of options, and that in her experience, the most dangerous people were not the ones who said no. They were the ones who said yes too quickly and meant something else. By 11:20 that same morning, 2 men in wool coats arrived at the lot in a vehicle that did not fit the neighborhood, introduced themselves as representatives of Hartwell Capital's Asset Recovery Division, and presented a notarized letter of authorization signed by Adrian Voss, requesting the immediate return of all items logged from a vehicle bearing the Ferrari's registration number. The letter was clean. The notarization was legitimate. The legal language was precise. Logan Pierce read it twice and found Mason. Mason took the letter, read it once from top to bottom, set it on the counter, and said, "The vehicle was towed under a police authorization issued at 2:51 in the morning of the previous date. That authorization predates this letter of custody by 11 hours and 12 minutes. Under the city's impound processing code, assets transferred under police authorization require coordination through the issuing precinct before a private transfer of contents can be executed." He said it without raising his voice or checking any reference, because he had spent 3 years in an environment where the difference between what a document authorized and what people claimed it authorized was regularly the thing that determined outcomes, and the habit of reading carefully had not left him. The man closest to the counter lowered his voice and said, in the register designed to communicate without creating a record, "This is an internal company matter, and the people who sent us are not accustomed to navigating the administrative preferences of operations like this one." Mason looked at him directly, then slid the letter back across the surface. He said, "The precinct on North Halsted will be able to coordinate with you. Good morning." When they left, Logan stood in the doorway looking at the space they had vacated with an expression that combined admiration and genuine concern in roughly equal proportion. He said, "Mason, that is Hartwell Capital. They have 200 lawyers." Mason said he understood. Logan said, "Do you understand what those lawyers do to people who inconvenience them?" Mason said he imagined it was unpleasant. He was not performing equanimity. He simply understood, at a level below anxiety, that he had already lost the version of his professional life that fear was supposed to be protecting, and the calculation was different now than it had been before they took it from him. That afternoon, Jazelle Hartwell returned to the lot for the second time. She came alone, in a cab, wearing a dark hoodie and plain trousers and nothing identifiable. She walked through the gate while Logan was on a call and found Mason in the back office, and she sat down across from his desk without being invited, which he noted without comment. She said she knew he had turned their people away that morning. He said yes. She said they would come back with something more coercive and that he was right to expect it. Then she said the thing that changed the shape of everything. She told him what was in the case. Not all of it, but enough. She told him the case contained documentation of a 3-year financial fraud totaling approximately $200 million, executed by a person with sufficient institutional authority to make any conventional investigation disappear before it reached anyone capable of acting on it, and that she needed it kept safe for 48 hours until she could place it in the hands of someone she trusted to be beyond that person's reach. Mason listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Hartwell Digital." She looked at him. He said it again, and this time it was not a question. He said, 14 months ago, I was a systems security engineer at Hartwell Digital. I was terminated on a charge of unauthorized data access with no investigation presented and no opportunity to respond. My name went onto a list that effectively ended my career in this industry. 3 days before my termination, I filed an internal report with my direct supervisor about irregular access patterns I had found in the server logs. Patterns I did not recognize. Patterns I believed indicated a possible intrusion. I thought I was doing my job. He looked at her steadily. He said, "Tell me the name that authorized my termination." Jazelle Hartwell looked at him for a long time. She made a 4-minute call to Charlotte, and when she set the phone down, she said one name. Adrian Voss had personally signed the authorization to remove Mason Cole from Hartwell Digital 14 months earlier. Not the HR director, not the division head, but the chief financial officer of Hartwell Capital. And the reason, invisible in the official record, was that Mason Cole had been approximately 90 minutes from documenting something that Adrian Voss could not afford to have entered into any accessible system. Mason took this in without visible change in expression, which was not the same as not feeling it. He looked at the leather case on the shelf behind him, the one he had photographed in the dark at 3 in the morning and carried in from the cold and logged under the correct line item and held for the right person. And then he looked at Jazelle Hartwell and said, "What happens to the other 5 people on that list?" Charlotte Reeves' office was on the 12th floor of a building on West Monroe that had no affiliation with Hartwell Capital. A deliberate arrangement she had made 2 years earlier when she had begun to sense, in the precise and patient way that careful lawyers develop such instincts, that the organization she worked for had places in it she had not yet examined and would eventually need to. The 3 of them sat around a table covered with files and legal pads by the time the meeting was an hour old. Charlotte at the head, working through the physical documents with the focused efficiency of someone who had done comparable work before. Jazelle to her left, still and attentive. Mason across from them both, reading from a printed summary that laid out, in 14 pages of controlled legal language, the full architecture of what Adrian Voss had constructed and maintained across 3 years. The case held 2 primary items. The first was the USB drive containing digital records Charlotte had assembled, transaction histories, access logs, email metadata showing instructions sent to the IT department about which records to modify and when to make those modifications disappear. The second was the physical contract, a 2021 agreement on Hartwell Capital letterhead bearing Adrian Voss's handwritten signature, authorizing the transfer of $47 million to an entity called the Meridian Infrastructure Development Fund. A fund that Charlotte had traced, through 4 consecutive layers of holding structures, to a personal account in the Cayman Islands under a beneficial ownership arrangement pointing back, without ambiguity, to AVX Holdings. When Charlotte looked up from the contract and said, in her measured way, that if this document was authenticated the man who signed it was not facing a civil proceeding, Mason noticed that Jazelle did not show surprise. She had known the magnitude of it for weeks. What she showed instead was the particular expression of someone who has been carrying a weight in isolation for a long time, and is now for the first time in a room where other people can see how heavy it actually is. Mason found his name on page 9. a list of 6 individuals under a heading that read Strategic Personnel Actions, fiscal years 2022 through 2023. Each entry had a date, a department, a termination classification, and a 3-letter code. Charlotte explained, without drama, that the code assigned to all 6 names was an internal designation Adrian had created to describe employees whose institutional knowledge or active work represented a direct risk to the concealment of the fraud. All 6 had been removed without cause, without process, without recourse. All 6 had had their professional reputations damaged through informal channels in the months that followed. Charlotte said this document alone was sufficient grounds to overturn every termination and establish a damages claim for each individual. Mason said nothing for a moment. He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at his name printed in a font designed for administrative efficiency, and he thought about 11 months of silence, about the job listings he had stopped checking, about the morning he explained to Caleb that he had decided he liked driving the big truck better than working at a desk. When he looked up, his expression had not changed in any way that most people would have identified as significant. Jazelle had been watching him, and she spoke. She said, "I did not know about these people." She said it with no preamble and no legal qualification and no carefully worded caveat. She said, "I inherited this company and I trusted the structure I was given, and I did not look hard enough at what it contained, and I was wrong." It was not an apology composed for a press release. It was a fact being stated plainly by a person who was not practiced at saying it and had decided to say it anyway, because the room required it. Mason looked at her and said, "There are 5 other people on that list who need to know what happened to them." The plan Charlotte outlined was straightforward. She would spend the next 24 hours completing the legal package, a formal evidentiary submission structured for federal review, with full chain of custody documentation on every item, including Mason's sworn statement about the discovery of the case and the original police property log as provenance. Jazelle would contact Elijah Drummond directly, a retired federal judge in his early 70s, a man who had known her father for decades and whose independence from the board's network of relationships was the one thing they could rely on completely. Mason would provide a sworn statement covering both the discovery of the case and, separately, the full circumstances of his original termination. Jazelle asked him, and this was the question Charlotte set down her pen to hear, whether he was prepared to participate in a process that would expose him to significant institutional pressure from an organization with resources that far exceeded anything available to him. Mason said, "I filed a report 14 months ago and lost everything I had built for it. I do not believe filing another one is going to make my situation materially worse." He said it without bravado. It was the arithmetic of a person who has already been through the worst of a calculation and is no longer afraid of the answer. The counter-pressure came before evening. Mason received the first notification at 6:14, an automated message from his commercial liability insurer flagging a formal complaint filed by a third-party legal entity against his operator's license, citing alleged deviation from standard impound protocol in the handling of a specific vehicle's property manifest. The complaint was technically framed, narrowly specific, and wrong in ways that would require at minimum a week to formally contest, which was precisely the point. Logan called at 6:31, already aware, trying to sound calmer than he was. Mason told him he knew, and that it would be addressed. Charlotte received her notice at 6:52. A formal communication from Hartwell Capital's legal division, terminating her consulting agreement effective immediately, citing a breach of confidentiality, and demanding the return of all company materials in her possession within 24 hours. She called Jazelle and explained, in the same measured register she used for everything, that the filing against Mason's license was designed to give him a concrete financially consequential reason to reconsider his involvement, and that no one would find fault with him if he chose to step back from a situation that was not his by any obligation. Jazelle was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I understand exactly what I am asking him to absorb." That sentence stayed with her on the drive to the lot at 11:45 that night. He was there alone, the office light casting a yellow rectangle onto the cracked asphalt, working at his desk with a printed draft of his statement beside the laptop, going through it with the unhurried attention of someone who has thought for a long time about what they want to say, and is now confirming that the written version is honest. He looked up when she walked in and did not seem surprised to find her there. Jazelle placed a thin folder on the desk between them without comment. She said Charlotte had recovered something in the final hours of document review. Not part of the original evidentiary package, but significant to Mason specifically. It was a two-message email chain, archived in a server log backup that had not been fully cleared. The earliest message had been sent by Adrian Voss to the head of human resources at Hartwell Digital, timestamped at 6:17 in the evening on a Monday in early spring 14 months before. The subject line read, M. Cole. Proceed with Plan B, no body. The response, sent 4 minutes later, read, confirmed for Tuesday morning. The metadata Charlotte had extracted showed that the instruction to terminate Mason Cole had been issued by Adrian Voss 90 minutes. Not 3 days, not after a review period 90 minutes. After Mason had submitted his anomaly report through the internal security portal. The order had been placed before anyone at the company level had officially been informed of the report. Mason had filed his observation into the system, and in the time it took him to drive home that evening, the decision to remove him had already been made. Mason looked at the timestamp on the page. The office was quiet enough that Jazelle could hear the distant low sound of traffic crossing the overpass 2 blocks north. She had prepared on the way over a version of what she intended to say, measured and forward-looking, the language of accountability and institutional repair. But sitting in the room with the file open between them and this man reading the confirmation of something he had known to be true for over a year, but had never been able to prove, she found that none of the prepared language was right. She said, "You were never wrong about what you saw." He looked at her. Then he looked back at the page, and he said with a quality in his voice that was not pride and not relieving, quieter and more durable than either, "I know." Those 2 words carried the full weight of 14 months in them. Every professional door that had closed without explanation, every careful conversation he had managed for his son's benefit, every night on the interstate when he had kept the original memory intact against the pressure of an official narrative that said he had imagined it or fabricated it or gotten it wrong. He had not gotten it wrong. The email had been sent 90 minutes after the report. There was nothing left to argue. He closed the laptop. They sat in the office for another half hour without speaking much. Jazelle looked through the window at the Ferrari under its tarp, still there in the lot like something unfinished, and she thought about the night she had driven it too fast and walked away from the most important thing she was carrying, and she thought about the improbable precision of what had followed. That the car had been found by someone who checked the floor panel, logged what he found in the correct category, and refused to hand it over to the first person who arrived and demanded it. She thought about what a different kind of person in that same situation would have done, how easily the case could have been opened or discarded or surrendered, how completely the evidence inside it would have disappeared. She did not say any of this out loud. But she stayed until midnight, and she told him she would be at Charlotte's office at 7 the following morning, and when she walked out through the lot and looked back once at the window, where he was still visible at his desk, she thought about her father's instruction. Find the next right thing, and thought that, for once, it had already been done before she arrived to look for it. Elijah Drummond was 71 years old, semi-retired from the federal bench, and possessed of the particular patience of a man who had spent 4 decades watching people hand him things and wait to be impressed. He was not easily impressed. He read the evidentiary package Charlotte had assembled across the full breadth of his desk without comment, pausing occasionally to cross-reference 2 documents or to hold a specific transaction figure against the corresponding account record. He read for 26 minutes. Then he set the package down, aligned its edges precisely with the desk edge, picked up his telephone, and dialed the regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission. He did not consult Jazelle or Mason or Charlotte before doing so. He had seen what was in the file, and what was in the file made his next action obvious. By 9:30 that morning, a formal investigation had been opened under emergency authorization. By 11, Hartwell Capital's board of directors had convened an unscheduled session from which Adrian Voss was explicitly excluded. By 1:15 in the afternoon, Adrian Voss had been placed on administrative suspension pending investigation, his credentials deactivated and his access to all company systems revoked in a process that took approximately 4 minutes from authorization to completion. By 4 in the afternoon, his legal team had contacted Charlotte to explore the possibility of terms, which Charlotte received without response and forwarded directly to the Commission's counsel. Mason was back at the lot when Charlotte called him at 4:45. He had gone in to work the afternoon shift because the shift needed covering, and because sitting in his apartment waiting for information was not something his temperament accommodated well. Logan had stayed also. ostensibly to complete a brake job on a flatbed, actually to be in the room when whatever was going to resolve finally resolved, in the way that people who are loyal to someone show up before they are asked. Charlotte told Mason what had happened in the order in which it occurred. She said the complaint against his operator's license had been formally withdrawn at 3 that afternoon. The filing entity had determined it was no longer in their interest to pursue it. She said Hartwell Capital would be contacting each of the 6 employees named in the Strategic Personnel Actions document within the coming week, and that the company had been advised in terms that left little interpretive room that the appropriate outcome was not a settlement with confidentiality provisions but a full and formal written acknowledgement. She said Mason would receive, in writing, a complete restoration of his professional record and a restitution package covering 26 months of lost compensation calculated at the salary level of his former position, with interest. She said all of it in the same tone she used for everything, which had the effect of making it simultaneously sound routine and carry exactly the weight it deserved. Mason said, "And the other 5?" Charlotte said, "All of them." He sat down on the running board of his truck, the same spot where he had sat with a cup of cold coffee a day and a half earlier, watching an empty stretch of road and knowing nothing yet, and he let the information settle without rushing it. It was not the resolution of something dramatic. There was no confrontation scene, no moment where the right person said the right words loudly in a room full of witnesses. There was a phone call and a file, and an old judge who had picked up a telephone because what he had read in front of him made the right action clear. Logan walked over and handed him a coffee without asking if he wanted one, and Mason took it. Jazelle Hartwell came to the lot for the 3rd time late that afternoon. The Ferrari had been collected the previous day. There was no professional reason for her to be there. She came through the gate on foot and found Mason in the bay, and she stood in the doorway with her coat folded over her arm and the late sun cutting low across the asphalt in the particular way that late sun does in October in Chicago, flat and honest, leaving nothing in shadow. She said the Ferrari was not why I came back. Mason said he knew. She told him she had created a new position, structurally independent from the board and from the CFO office, reporting only to the CEO. The role was built to do what the existing compliance structure had failed to do, to find the things that were wrong before they became disasters, to document them without political interference, and to place them in front of the right people without the process being managed or slowed by the people it was designed to scrutinize. She said she needed someone who had demonstrated that they would do that job correctly when it cost them something real, because the role only had value if the person filling it was not afraid of the cost. Mason said, "You describe that as a warning." Jazelle looked at him. She said, "I am interviewing." It was the first moment of genuine lightness she had offered across 2 full days of crisis, and it landed differently from everything else, carrying beneath it a different kind of acknowledgement, the kind that does not require a formal name or a prepared speech, the kind that exists between 2 people who have been through something together and are standing on the other side of it, and have not yet decided what to call where they are. Mason looked at her for a moment, then turned back to the work on the bench in front of him and said, "I will think about it." It was not a no. The lot went quiet in the way that places go quiet at the end of a working day, when the light has changed and the last of the effort has been spent and what remains does not yet require anything. The Ferrari was gone. The leather case was in federal custody. 6 names on a list that had never been meant to be found were about to have their records corrected, one by one, in writing, because one person on a cold night had lifted a floor panel and logged what was underneath it, and refused to give it away to the first person who asked for it without the correct documentation. Not every wrong thing announces itself with noise. Some of it sits still in the dark, waiting for the specific kind of person who does the job a little more carefully than it requires, and who keeps what they are given safe until the right hands come to receive it. Not everything left behind is lost. Sometimes it is simply waiting to be found by the right person.